together. That's it. You're ready?
Ready, whenever you are.
All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. So my name is Frank Slack. It's January 24th, 2024. And one reason why I'm mentioning the 2024 is that it turns out this is the 60th anniversary of the world's very first self-adhesive stamp. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So shown on this slide here on the right is a collection of stamps that I bought on HitStamp last year, mainly because it just caught my eye, all of the different shapes and sizes and papers and all the varieties that you see in modern day stamps. It's clear that modern stamps are no longer just rectangular pieces of art. They can come in all different shapes and sizes and papers but the thing that we're going to talk about today is the innovation that's on the back of the stamp, which is this self-adhesive nature of modern day stamps. So it's clear from this image, for example, that this set down here at the bottom from Vanuatu is clearly a self-adhesive issue. You would peel it off and you stick it on an envelope, much like we all are familiar to do right now. But one thing that's been not as clear from this is that the world's very first self-adhesive stamp is actually also in this collection. I don't know if anybody can point it out, but if you cannot, I can certainly help you out in the end. But does it look familiar to anybody? It's actually this guy, the top from Sierra Leone. And in 1964, so that's the one that we're going to be talking about today. And for those of you that are here in person, you're in for a little treat because I brought the set with me, and I'm going to hand it around. One thing that you'll notice about the talk today is that the stamps that we're going to be talking about are very visual and very tactile, and I encourage you to pull these out and feel them. I don't mind, they're not very expensive stamps, so I don't mind, that you guys are touching them, but just to get a sense of the novelty behind these stamps. When you think about the fact that these are 60 years old, it's quite amazing to think what technology went into them. So one thing that I've always been interested in, right from the early days of my stamp collecting years, is the technology that goes into stamps. And my very first collection was actually on the phosphorus exams and the papers of the British Machins series, which is the Queen's Head series. But today, we're going to talk about the back of the stamps. So I'm going to hand this around. You guys are welcome to take a look at it, and then we can talk about that towards the end of the talk as well. So I've titled this A Brief History of Self-Adhesive Stamps, and talk about how that very first stamp from Sierra Leone 60 years ago has really been a harbinger of all the self-adhesive stamps that you see in the world today. I've subtitled this The Demise of Lick and Stick and the Rise of Peel and Stick. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the talk today. So on the next slide, please, just a few definitions. If you just look at Wikipedia for self-adhesive, they actually do have some definitions there. A traditional lick and stick stamp is scientifically considered a moisture activated stamp. You have to put some water on it to turn the gum gooey and get it to stick to the paper. A peel and stick stamp is actually considered a pressure sensitive adhesive. So all you have to do is push it, you peel it off, you push it onto the envelope, and it's actually the pressure that bonds the adhesive to the paper. So we're quite used to these kinds of things today. We see them in tapes and labels and sticky notes and all different kinds of things. But think back to 1964 when these things came out, and you can imagine what sort of a novelty this actually was. If we go to the next slide, please. Did we? No, this is not coming up. And you go forward again. Okay, this is good. This is good. Okay, so this is actually a newspaper article from the New York Times in 1997. It's actually by a Boston reporter. It's in the top right there that it was actually a reporter from Boston, and it talks for the first time about how even in the United States these peel and stick stamps are starting to become more common. And he mentions in this article that this is a boon for people that don't like to lick stamps. They don't like the taste. They don't think it's hygienic. Whatever the reason, he was sort of also predicting that ultimately we were going to go from 80% to 100% of the US stamps would be produced in this in this peel and stick fashion, and that turned out to be correct. So in the next, if you hit forward, so it turns out that even in 1997, you know, it was already clear that the US was heading towards 100% self-adhesive stamps, and we'll talk in a few minutes about when we actually got to that point here in this country. But I'm going to tell you that even though the United States has been the greatest adopter of these peel and stick stamps, they're not the granddaddy of these stamps. Self-adhesive stamps were not invented in this country. They were not used first in this country. They were used first in Sierra Leone. We're going to talk about how they came to be in a minute. So in the next, if you can just push forward for me. So we're going to talk today about how these stamps came to be, why they came to be, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the trajectory. So how did that initial innovation find its way into all of the self-adhesive stamps that we see on the today? So next slide, please. Yeah, so where, when, and why did these stamps start? Next, please. And then, yeah, what is the path to them becoming so dominant? How do we move from lick and stick to peel and stick in a shorter minute? So I'm going to take you back now to 1963 and 1964, when the world was really being shaken by new ideas, new music, new social norms, women's rights, civil rights, the psychedelic movement. If you can put yourself back in 1964, the Beatles had their very first #1 hit at the same time as these stamps came out. All right, if you can go forward one slide. So at the same time, it turns out the world of stamps was being sort of shaken by novel ideas as well. And in particular, two novel stamps from the countries of Tonga and Sierra Leone were issued at this time. Next button. We're going to see that these stamps were completely unorthodox. And you can imagine how stamp collectors and how the stamp public reacted to these stamps when they first came out. I've brought examples of them with me today. Some of them are pretty glaring. They were maligned by critics and collectors for their extreme appearance and the gimmicky nature. What I'm hoping to tell you about today is that even though that was the case, and I think we can all agree that it must have been a big shock when it came out at the time, they were really the forerunners of what we see in stamp design right now. And pretty innovative for their day. Next, please. Yeah, so in hindsight, I said these were pioneering stamps. And they were really forerunners of the current boom in not only, I'm going to talk about in a minute, die cut and self-adhesive stamps, but also we should recognize them for their technological advances that they ushered into the world of stamp design. Next slide, please. So these are the two sort of spectacular and innovative stamps that were issued at this time. So it turns out in July of 1963, Tonga issued this gold coin commemorative.
The black part of that stamp was that.
Sorry,
Singular stamp or was it a square stamp?
no, the stamp was the circle. I brought it with me today. Well, I brought one example from that collection.
Big boy too. Wow. Wow.
Okay, I'm going to hand these around so you guys can take a look. So this was a set of, I think, 13 or 14 stamps. The one I brought with me today is the biggest of the stamps in that set. And I'll show you in a minute how they look relative to this one. In February of 1964, so that will be like in 2 weeks' time, 60 years ago, Sierra Leone issued a stamp that was die cut to be the exact same dimensions of the country on a map. And you would peel it off from the green backing and stick it onto the envelope. So if you want to hand those around again, you can.
So that's not the stamp. The stamp is actually
The stamp is
the eye in the middle.
it's the sticker on the green. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, looking at the back.
I thought it was part of. I was like,
Yeah,
what? That's not.
So-
Eric.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool. I mean, this was so just so you know, these designs were pretty radical.
Feel
for the
it.
day.
Raised.
Yeah, I mean, this was the world's first non-rectangular stamp. Okay?
Really?
Yes, yeah. The world's first circular stamp. It was the world's first stamp printed on something other than paper. It's actually printed on gold foil. So when you look at this, let me give that one to you. It's actually gold foil that it's printed on.
Does this peel off?
This was the, sorry, what's the question?
Peel this off?
I'm going to tell you in a minute about that one. Yeah. It was the world's first, it was the world's biggest stamp when it came out it was the world's heaviest stamp when it came out. It was the world's most expensive stamp to produce, as you can imagine, printing on gold foil. And boy, did it put Tonga on the map. And this issue got a lot of press. I'm going to show you in a minute. The New York Times picked up on this stamp and talked about it in one of their issues. This stamp came out a little bit later, but equally innovative. This was the first die-cut stamp, the first stamp that wasn't in a regular shape like a rectangle or a triangle or a circle. All right. Next slide.
Do they come on sheets?
Yeah, I'm going to show you that. Yeah. So,
I had no idea that there were no
there were triangular stamps.
round stamps
No.
that stamps before the sixties.
Oh, no triangles even?
There were triangles before the 60s. Yeah.
Yeah.
In like on the Cape of Good Hope in 1860, there were triangles. All right. So you might be wondering why. Yes, it turns out these stamps were produced with a novel adhesives. Even though they were really radical in the front, it's the back that's also radical. Okay, they had novel adhesive in each case, and it was actually a legitimate reason, even though they were maligned with being gimmicky. They were actually produced in a particular way to prevent the regular gum from sticking and curling in the humid climate of these countries. So if you can go to the next slide, it turns out that Tonga is an island in the Pacific that's just north of the Tropic of Capricorn. And Sierra Leone is a country in the bulge of Africa that's just north of the equator. And so they were having issues in their postal service with not only the stamps with regular gum curling, but also in the post office, the stamps were sticking, the sheets were sticking to each other. So they went to the printers and said, can you help us with something to prevent these things? So we'll talk about that in a minute now. So next slide. Yeah, so these are two articles that came out in the New York Times. This was the article that actually described the Tonga issue.
The bomb and big stamps.
Yeah. It says Tonga doubles its gold coin in postal issue. And then this was the article that came out about a week after the issue from Sierra Leone. They talked about Sierra Leone produces a unique adhesive and describes their stamp. So I put this in a bit of comments, from these humble beginnings, because really these weren't so humble. Think of this stamp. I mean, it's not very humble.
There's nothing humble about that.
And yet, nowadays, stamp design has totally embraced these kind of new techniques and technologies. And these were the forerunners for ideas that are now taken over the stamp design world. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the first day cover from that Tonga issue. The stamp that I brought in today is this 15 shilling stamp over here in the top corner. That was the largest stamp in the set, or at least an example of the largest stamp in the set. So you can see many stamps all printed on gold foil. One thing that is apparent from these issues is that they were not very easy to cancel. I mean, it was so thick that the cancel didn't work very well. It didn't stick on the stamp. Sometimes the cancel caused the gold foil to actually lift off. So they were not very great stamps from that perspective, but certainly interesting stamps to look at. So these, by the way, I didn't mention that all of the examples I'm telling you about today are from my collection. So I'm using my own examples today. Next slide, please. Okay, so where were these stamps produced and how were they produced? It turns out that both of these issues were printed in the United Kingdom by what is now a well-known stamp producing company called Walsall. In those days, they were called Walsall Lithographic, but they later became Walsall Security Printing, and they produced many of the British definitive stamps. They produced stamps for countries all around the world. But up until this date, the date of these two issues, they had never produced a postage stamp. So they had new technology that these postal administrations were seeking, but they never used them to produce a stamp yet. So it turns out the stamps were produced on a paper by Samuel Jones, and they later became Wiggins Teeth. And Samuel Jones had produced paper for the British Mail, for the Royal Mail, that had been used to produce stamps. And they had also produced many gummed papers and labels and stickers for the commercial use, but they'd also never produced a self-adhesive stamp. So Tonga and Sierra Leone engaged Walsall to print these two stamps using lithography for both of them. This one's also embossed. If you have a chance to feel along it, you can feel how nice and raised it is. And this one uses thermography as well. So if you want to sort of run your fingers across here, for example, you can feel that's also raised. It's sort of like a glitter glue that they use to sort of print on the stamps. Next issue. So let's talk a little bit now about the backs of these stamps. So both of these stamps have a novel adhesive, but the question that I pose is, which is truly the first self-adhesive stamp? Both of them are very novel, and they both solve the issue of stamps sticking to each other and curling during humid, hot climates. But which one is truly self-adhesive? So if you go to the next slide. So it turns out that there are actually multiple reports. If you just Google world's first self-adhesive stamp, you will find that there are articles in the Philatelic Press and there are certain erroneous notes in catalogs that the Tonga coinage set was the world's first self-adhesive stamp. But I can tell you that both through my research and also from what you guys can tell just by feeling these stamps, you know that they are not self-adhesive. Okay, so the backs of the stamps have a very interesting feel to them. They don't feel like gum to you. The reason is that these stamps have a gum embedded within a resin. The resin is keeping the paper nice and taut. You still need to water activate this gum. Yeah. So these stamps were actually sort of dunked in water and then they were placed on yeah. Ceruleum is truly the first self-adhesive stamp. So if you go to the next
Is that
slide.
the same thing they use for like cast material?
It looks like it, doesn't it?
It does.
It could, yeah, it looks like it, yeah. Yeah, you can take a look at the back of that one.
You take the water,
Yeah, I mean, you
What?
can imagine licking that thing.
even though there's one thing going on a piece of paper, what's the rest of the envelope?
So yes, it turns out that this set is not actually self-adhesive. Go to the next slide, please. So these stamps were printed on Samuel Jones paper, the same paper or same company that produced the cerulean stamp, but they were produced with a special water-activated gum called DAVAC. And if you go to the next slide, I did a bit of research on that, and you can find what this DAVC is. So, for example, in this issue from Dudley Stamps, he actually reports from Samuel Jones what what went into the stamp. And you can read it for yourself later if you wish, but it's basically they put a resin onto the stamp and then they embedded the gum within the resin. You still need to water activate the stuff. All right, next slide, please. So this is the winner. This is the very first the world's first
It's an awesome looking stamp anyways.
Yeah, so that's what it looks like when it's peeled off the backing. This is the first day cover from this issue. It was actually a commemorative to commemorate the 1964 New York World's Fair. This one was actually stamped at the stamped in ceruleum, but you can see that they were not shy about telling the world that this was the first self-adhesive stamp. They were also not shy about saying this is the world's first free-form die-cut self-adhesive stamp. So they killed two birds with one stone there. Next slide, please. So somebody asked earlier, how were these printed? It turns out they came on sheets of 30 like this. I actually have some examples of these. I don't have every one on a full sheet, but I can attest to this. This is how they look. I haven't been able to find a good explanation for exactly how they were printed, but it seems like they were probably laid on the paper and then die cut from the paper and then the backing between the stamps peeled away. But I haven't seen a good example explaining that myself, but I'm still looking for that. So this was the set. There was also a large set. They had a set of regular stamps and a set of airmail stamps. You can see a slightly different view. The ceruleum is curved in the regular stamp and straight in the airmail stamps. Next slide, please. So if you turn the stamps around, maybe you guys noticed that as well. Samuel Jones didn't fail to recognize that they could put advertising on the back of these stamps now. And so they put their own advertising, the Samuel Jones on the back of the stamps. In fact, this butterfly is their logo, the Camberville butterfly, something like that. So it turns out in later issues from Sierra Leone and other countries, they sold this to companies to put their own ads on the back of stamps. Next slide. Yeah, so they were not shy, so, you know, the companies that were producing this was also, and, Samuel Jones were not shy about letting the world know that they had produced these things. They sent out, multiple different postcards that actually had the stamps on them. This one came from, Walsall, this one came from Samuel Jones. A little later on, they produced the world's first definitive series as well, also self-adhesive, and they wrote about that as well. So you can find these very, very commonly on eBay, so they sent out many of them. Next slide, please. So they actually followed up this design with a slightly different commemorative series a few months later. This was actually to commemorate John F. Kennedy, and a very similar set of regular mail stamps and airmail stamps. This is the first they cover just of the regular mail stamps. I show this because it's kind of interesting to me that it was addressed from Sierra Leone to the president, or the managing director, against the CEO and equivalent here, of actually also with the graphics. So they sent the president an example of his stamps. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, next slide. Okay, so by the 5th anniversary of the production of the world's first self-adhesive stamps, these two companies were still sending out promotional materials, and they were generating a lot of business. We're going to talk in a minute. They picked up multiple new postal administrations to actually print stamps in a similar kind of manner. And in fact, every Sierra Leone stamp for the next 10 years after 1964 was produced in a self-adhesive manner. And some of them are pretty outrageous, if you consider that, but also quite attractive. And there's one in the shape of a golden eagle, some in the shape of coconuts, and other things that are also tropical for the country. Next slide, please. So it turns out that Tonga does come back into the picture, because Tonga was the country that produced the world's second self-adhesive stamps. Okay, so even though they're sometimes incorrectly credited as having the first one from 1963, this was truly their first self-adhesive stamp. It's this banana issue. This is the first they cover that shows all of the stamps in that banana set in combination with some of the more traditional stamps that were also coming out from Tonga at the time. So I think this is a pretty cool cover that shows there's a new with the old. And so this was in 1969. So it took, 4 or 5 years for other countries to sort of latch onto this idea. But who do you think used these stamps? Yeah, it was the same as it was Walsall and Samuel Jones. So they were definitely picking up new kinds.
Well, they came up with a banana cancel too.
And a banana cancel, yeah. So pretty cool. All right, so next slide, please. The third country to issue self-adhesive stamps was actually Bhutan in 1969, so just after the Tonga issue. Now, what's cool about these stamps is that once again, they were produced on a totally novel type of material. These stamps are actually printed on silk cloth. So I didn't bring this in because I don't really want people rubbing their hands into these, but then you can feel this is like cloth. And it turns out this is the same cloth that is used in Buddhist prayer rituals. So a pretty amazing set, but once again, very, very non-traditional in terms of the look and the feel. And it's rectangular, but other than that, there's nothing normal about the set. A very cool set. Next slide, please. Okay, so things were starting to pick up now. Other countries were using Walsall and Samuel Jones to produce their stamps. You can see this is a stamp from 1974 from Norfolk Island, a very similar idea to the Sierra Leone one, where they printed the stamp in the shape of the island. This was the very first self-adhesive stamp from Europe. This is from Gibraltar, also produced by the same printers and paper makers. And then the first stamp from North America, so from the island of Montserrat, produced their set in 1975. Next slide. Okay, so while these countries were adopting this new technology and using Walsall and Samuel Jones, there were experimental like I said, experimental efforts going around the world to try and produce self-adhesive stamps. And it turned out the first self-adhesive stamp from the United Kingdom was not produced officially by the Royal Mail. It was produced by a private person known as Derek Warboys, who used Her Majesty's Stationery Office to produce these stamps. So they're in the shape with, you know, the Queen's head that's very familiar to sort of people who collect Great Britain. It's basically the nation head, but these are actually self-adhesive stamps. Each of the stamps is basically in the shape of a rectangle like that. This is an example of a cover that shows one of those self-adhesive stamps in combination with a regular nation stamp. So you can see they were a little larger, but a similar design. So these were produced in 1974, and in fact, they were issued on the 10th anniversary of the Sierra Leone stamp. So they were obviously cognizant of what had happened 10 years before, and they were celebrating it and trying to build on it. If you go to the next slide, it turns out that there were 3 different issues of these self-adhesive stamps. This was the second issue, also produced by Warboys. In this particular issue, he had a slightly bigger stamp. This is what the stamp looks like over here. And he had included a little logo here that says, "You just can't lick self-adhesive stamps for speed and hygiene." And why this is sort of interesting is because the Royal Mail thought that was actually antagonistic to their business, and they refused to cancel anything that had this label. So they would cover it up before they canceled it. They didn't want people thinking that licking was bad. And yet, here was this was the guy who was saying, "Don't lick anymore. Use my stamps, and you don't have to do that." And then there was the third issue in the next few months, was produced by another private citizen called John Daines, and he produced a set that was circular in shape with the same octagonal center for the stamp. And maybe what you can see on this is an example of the first issue here, which is the rectangle, and then the complete set of the third issue, and then some regular nation stamps there as well.
Now, these come on sheets that they peeled off, or?
Yeah, so they came out in sheets of, I think, like 20, something like that. You peel them off, yeah. So next slide. So it turns out that the Royal Mail did ultimately end up producing self-adhesive stamps, but in only 1993. So, 20 years after those first Warboy stamps came out in the UK. And I was able to find this cover, which was produced in a commercial sense, but it was basically a first day cover of the first Royal Mail self-adhesive stamp in combination with the old Warboy stamp. So I thought that was a nice touch that they.
I like the cancel.
Yeah. Licky ends. So yes, this is a unique combination self-adhesive first day covers with the 1974 stamp and the 1993 stamp. And they only produced 500 of these, 800 of these. So I thought that was a nice touch. So 1993 was essentially the beginning of self-adhesive stamps for the Royal Mail. And now, of course, everything is self-adhesive and in the UK as well. Next slide, please. So let's come back to the United States, and some of you will certainly remember this one if you were around long enough. The very first self-adhesive stamp from the United States was issued in November 15th, 1974, and it was the Christmas stamp, the Peace on Earth dove stamp, shown here on the first day cover. Now, this was produced by Avery Dennison. If any of you have ever tried to
Framingham, right?
print labels, yeah. You've fed their labels through your computer. This is the company. So basically the same sort of idea as a label you can pull off and stick on an envelope. They used to produce a stamp. Now this stamp, unfortunately, was very expensive to produce, and used a rubber-based adhesive which didn't actually perform very well. If you have this stamp in your collection, and you can almost tell from this one, you can tell that it starts to color, it starts to get orange. This is a rubber-based adhesive that was leaking through the paper and has spoiled any of these stamps.
I didn't notice it says pre-canceled on it. Is that a pre-canceled stamp?
The pre-canceled 10, US 10.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, I'm not too sure how that would be used, but, it- I guess when you buy it and you put it on an envelope, it didn't need to be canceled after that, although this one was for the first grade issue.
Dude, I just noticed that, but I've got sheets of those.
And they're probably all looking quite yellow.
No, that is amazing, some of them, we go ahead and cook,
Oh, good.
and I'm trying to preserve it so they're good.
Yeah. Good luck to you. So,
But I never noticed the pre-cancel one, I gotta go back and look at it.
yeah, so this is a rubber-based adhesive, and so some of you will know that if you ever used the old versions of Scotch tape and things like that, they're horrible. They brown. You know, if you ever used those old
Yeah.
photo albums where you put your photos in them, yeah, that was the same sort of adhesive. And about this time, 3M was coming up with magic tape, which was not rubber-based, but it was acrylic-based. And so in the next slide, this was the first successful US self-adhesive stamp that was actually produced on that acrylic adhesive, more like a magic tape than a Scotch tape. So this was the Eagle and Shield issue of 1989. It turns out that this issue was kind of controversial because while it had a face value of 25 cents, you actually had to pay extra to buy these stamps. There was a little surcharge. The post office would make you pay more, I guess, to buy the self-adhesive version. But ultimately, this was a very successful issue, and it led to the release of many more self-adhesives, so that by the year 2000, most of the US issues were coming out self-adhesive. Next slide, please. So the sort of floodgates were kind of opening now. Many countries were adopting this technology. So Japan had their first self-adhesive stamp in 1989. This is an example on first day cover. It was a booklet of these two stamps. Quite a pretty set. Next slide, please. Canada had their first self-adhesive stamps in 1989, also in a booklet. It was the Canadian flag. You can see that this particular stamp also has that rectangular shape that is was sort of becoming a feature of self-adhesive stamps. But I'm going to show you in a minute. It didn't take long for the world didn't view these as stamps without a particular feature on them. So next slide. Oh, sorry. One more slide. Yeah, so basically the French also came up with their first self-adhesive stamp early in 1990. It was a booklet with Marianne on the stamps produced by this printer over here. And then in the next slide, I think you're going to see the issue from Australia, the very first self-adhesive from Australia, and they reintroduced that perforation on the edge of the stamps, even though they were self-adhesive. And now that's a pretty common feature you see in many self-adhesive stamps. So the public still likes to think that they're using a stamp and a feature of stamp on the perforation. So this was from 1990, May 1990. The next issue is the first issue from New Zealand, 1991. This was the Kiwi issue from the definitive series. And then pretty much the floodgates open. So one thing that I forgot to say earlier is, I think it was on my slide that I didn't mention it. If you go to Colnect.com and you just search for self-adhesive, you can see that almost like 170 countries around the world have now issued self-adhesive stamps. So the vast majority of postal administrations are issuing self-adhesive stamps. It was only really after the early 90s that this really took off. The question that I failed to ask you guys early on is that even though the United States has sort of adopted this new technology, many countries have now also adopted it. Question I have for you is, how many stamp issues do you think the United States has issued that are now self-adhesive? Anybody want to guess? You can find this information on Colnect. It's actually over 5,000.
Really?
Yeah, so 5,000 stamp issues now issued self-adhesive. And if you go to the next slide, I think I'm just going to end by saying yes. So Sierra Leone celebrated the 40th anniversary of the first self-adhesive stamp back in 2004 with a reproduction of their earlier stamp. And this was also self-adhesive, you could peel this off the backing. And then in the next issue, next step, I just wanted to mention that in 2020, the USPS announced that they were not going to be producing lick and stick stamps anymore. So, that every stamp since 2020 has been self-adhesive in the United States. And I imagine many postal administrations around the world are doing the same thing. So this was a headline from Lynn's saying say goodbye to lick and stick US stamps. And well, I don't think that many of us necessarily miss the licking part of the stamps. I think many of us miss the ability to flip these things off envelopes. If any of you do still like to float your stamps off envelopes, which I do, it's extremely frustrating when you find that the self-adhesive will not, lift. Yeah, it's no longer water soluble and cannot be lifted off an
I
envelope.
found out how to do that today.
So now we're in there cutting the stamps out of the envelope and basically just keeping them on the backing paper. That's how you pretty much have to collect them that way.
Well, today they showed at the museum how to get the stamp off the paper with the
Yeah.
self-adhesive stamp.
Oh, they were using self-adhesive stamps for that? Okay.
Yeah, no, we had some self-adhesive stamps on paper, and they showed us how to get the paper off
Oh,
the stamp.
So there is a way, but you have to put them in like benzene or something.
No, there's a, took a picture of it.
Okay, so I'll come and ask you about that in a minute.
Okay,
So this is, so the US has completely adopted this technology 56 years after that first issue. If you go to the next slide, I just want to say this point, not to necessarily equate these two, but just talk about how in 1840, the world's first adhesive stamp was produced, and in 1964, the world's self-adhesive stamp. And the last bit is that, if you go to the next slide, in this year, we celebrate the 60th anniversary of stamps. The point I want to make, just to reiterate, is how far we've come in 60 years from, traditional way of sort of licking a rectangular stamp and putting it on an envelope. If any of you had to do hundreds of these, you know how horrible that was on your tongue, to now being able to nail all your Christmas cards or your holiday cards by just peeling things off and sticking them on. I also want to mention that I have children that are in their 20s. They don't remember licking stamps. So we've come a long way from the old days. And now, of course, we have these sort of beautiful new options for stamp designers that can really make things leap off the page. This is a great example that I found just from the UK. It's basically the fruit issue where the stamp proceeds out of the rectangle. So just wanted to say I applaud these early stamp designers who took a risk back in 60 years ago and were essentially maligned by the press, but turned out to be real harbingers of the future. So I'm going to end it there. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Nice job.
Now you can get surgical masks and paper and.
one of your slides, you had a picture, Phil Country, was that one stamp or four stamps?
If you go back a slide
Go back,
and back,
keep going.
back. This one?
No,
Sorry,
Back,
that one?
keep going back.
back. This?
No. Yeah, and it's before these,
What was it of? Which stamp?
so was it, one of the countries, it's right there.
Oh, this, yeah?
That one stamp, is that four?
No, this is four
Four
stamps.
stamps.
Yeah, you can peel them off each
Oh, okay.
individually, yeah.
So that, but the ones where I correct the artifacts, that's stays on the paper, it's not part of the stamp.
Yeah, so this is the backing over here. You can see that they actually had to put instructions there, bend and peel.
And that's how, like, most commemoratives come out now, is kind of in that format.
Yeah,
It-
because
Without
without
the Without the bend and peel.
Yeah, you bought this from the post office in 1970. Well, we know how to use it.
No.
Like, where's the perforation? Why am I tearing it out of licking it? No, you have to be instructed to bend it and peel it. The same here, bend and peel. So,
Do you happen to know what the last US lickable stamp was?
that's a good point. I should figure out what that is and put it in my collection.
Yeah,
That was the end of an era.
It's probably the flag stamp.
one of those flag stamps?
Yeah, because they've been putting those out
They used to use it for
forever.
Machines, you know, they used to.
The coil stamps, I think last coil was a stamp, it was a flag.
Okay, I should definitely look at that, yeah.
I may be wrong, but. I had no idea that until the Sierra Leone die cut, there were no odd shaped stamps.
Mhm.
It was rectangle, square, triangle, no circles
Yeah,
either.
circles.
No,
That seems, that's unreal.
I had no idea. I would have assumed that somebody would have done it before that.
But it's gonna be a backing on it, right? How would you make a sheet of brass?
Yeah,
So, yeah, it's fascinating.
And
That's
it wasn't
really
simply
cool.
round, it was the shape of the country, that's.
Yeah.
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 Oh, I'm buying some little Sierra Leones. Those things, I think those are actually beautiful. I think those are really
I've
cool.
got some extra.
How readily available are these?
These Sierra Leone stamps?
Yeah, like the first one
No, I mean, the set is very cheap. I think they made 100,000 or 200,000 sets. And you can buy them for, like 20 cents on eBay.
Oh,
So not,
definitely
not
buy it.
bad. I'm gonna bring you a set if you want, but extras.
Oh, I love it, yeah. 'cause-
One reason that I have extras is that you sometimes have to buy the set to find there's some flaws. And sometimes I don't know what I'm getting when I buy a set, but there'll be a flawed one in there. And so then I can add that flawed one to my collection. So when they did the thermography, sometimes when the thermography left the plate, it actually left streaks of the ink of the stamp, so you can collect those streaks, which are kind of cool. And then they ended up making good use of these stamps. So while they produced, maybe a few 100,000 sets, they ended up surcharging them with multiple different surcharges along the way. When they went to decimal currency, they surcharged them. This is an example of the 3 cent on an old currency. And so they used up all of the examples that they had by surcharging them. So at some point they probably, they may not be as abundant as we think because they were surcharged multiple times along the way.
One thing I didn't understand was, the first, British ones, were not produced by Royal Mail, but were produced by, I think you said, the Queen's Post
Yeah, if you go back, if you, no,
Office
you
or
agree with
something. So what is the Queen's Post
that, yeah.
Office?
It's Her Majesty's Stationery Office.
Her Majesty's
Yeah,
Stationery.
so I haven't figured out exactly what this meant, but I believe it was private citizens could go to the stationery office and pay for stationery essentially. So you could buy your envelopes that were already pre-ordered with your addresses on them, for example, or something like that.
Okay,
So and then these guys had the idea, well, if you can produce a sticker that has my address on it, why don't you produce a stamp that has something valuable?
and the names of the 2 gentlemen that you referred to, those must have been, were those the head of Her Majesty's office?
No, they were private citizens that went to the office.
Oh,
And
okay.
they asked the office to produce these instead of producing a regular piece of stationery for them. And then they subsequently went to the Royal Mail and got permission to, that these would be valid stamps. So these are valid stamps. They were legal stamps, just they weren't produced by the Royal Mail.
And I guess the reason they were legal is because they were printed by Her Majesty's office.
I'm not sure what that means. I need to find out more about that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Wow.
Oh, thank you. Great.
Yeah,
That was really interesting.
Yeah,
That
really
was
interesting.
really interesting.
I wonder what USPS would say if I went to them and said, I'd like to try to print a stamp.
you can probably do that now through the internet. I think
No, you
you
can't.
can produce your
No,
stamps.
you can't. Every single country that was doing it has stopped.
Oh, really?
Because you used to be able to do it in Singapore, you could do it here, and they've all canceled that service.
They all have. huh?
Yep, because I tried to do it. I wanted to make some stamps. And when Enjoy was looking for stamps for the Lions Club, all the countries that were issuing stamps, personalized stamps, have all stopped.
Hmm.
Or